John has been on the Well Dwellers podcast with me. He's shared some amazing stories about his son Edward last year at the Deeper Communion conference, and I'm excited for him being willing to share today too. So, John, you have the floor.
Awesome, Eric. Thanks. And Ty, I miss seeing Leland at church and sparring with him, so maybe that again someday soon. All right, I took serious your half-hour talk invitation, Eric, and I think I'm at about 25 minutes, so I'll get right into it. For the past 30 years, I've been a pastor in Calgary, trying to follow a bit of a unique calling, one that sought to engage God's revelation through both of God's books, through the Bible and through creation. So early on, trying to be relevant, I did a lot of preaching and writing about God's truth in pop culture, music, film, art, sport, current affairs, and wrote a book called The Day Metallica Came to Church, Searching for the Everywhere God in Everything. Then I spent several years going down the bunny hole of vocation and preaching sermons on God's image-bearing nature, how God is uniquely imaged in the jobs of accountants and doctors and electricians, stylists, translators, and cleaners, and wrote a book called Every Job a Parable. And then after that, went down one particular sphere of vocation quite deeply for 5 or 6 years, exploring for God's truth in science and nature. So I preached about God's empirical mind as it's imaged in a radiation physicist, or in chemical catalysts, or neural stress-reducing mechanisms, or the biomechanics of a human knee, or a knee surgeon. And I wrote a book called God Speaks Science. So I was on a trajectory and was starting into a fourth book on the theology of animals when another book cut in. And it's a book that I now realize is the most important thing I'll ever write. One that I could arguably only really be able to write after 30 years of learning how to exegete God's revelation through created things. A book about the parable of my life with my son Edward, who has Down syndrome. For years, I knew I needed to write it. For years, I knew God was speaking a beautiful story, a mysterious, painful, transformative, revealing story. But yeah, about a year and a half ago, I got the nudge and was told indirectly that now is the time for that to happen. And looking back, having written other books, definitely this book came together most quickly. At points, I thought it was being downloaded, which is pretty amazing. And then finding a publisher happened very quickly, a small publisher in the U.S., but engaging the editorial process with them, the perfect publisher for this book. And it feels, unlike the others, to be the most anticipated. I can write about the theology of science or art or something and post it on social media and you get a little chatter. But if I write something about a story that's happened with my son Edward, everybody is all over it. So, I got a book coming out this fall called Thy Tender Care, What Caregiving and Disability Teach Us About the Kingdom of God. And the dedication pretty much says it all. Quote, "For my son Edward, who has taught me the deepest truths about God. Truths about receiving life, being yourself, learning new languages, seeing new worlds, and truths, always those truths pointing to a little bit more understanding about the wisdom of God and what God is like." Now, I thought at this point in writing this, I could give you an overview of the book, and that would be fairly boring, or I could share an excerpt from the book, which I just realized this morning, Eric, is the story of panic attacks that you heard last year at that thing. I should have gone back to that conference and seen what I talked about. Anyway, this is what that raw story now looks like in a pretty well finally edited portion of a chapter called Embracing Weakness. So you're going to be an online first reading of anything that comes from the book Thy Tender Care. Here's an excerpt, about a 11-minute section of chapter 3, which is a chapter entitled Embracing Weakness. Several years ago, I experienced a panic attack, the first in a series that would upend my life for months. I didn't understand what was happening. At times, I couldn't breathe, and I wondered whether I was losing my mind. And if you've ever been there, you know the feeling. An out-of-control anxiety mixed with an impending sense of doom. It took months for me to recover. And once things settled, I prayed, earnestly prayed, that it would never happen again. But then, early one morning, about a year ago, it did happen again. Unlike the first time, I had a better sense of what was happening, was in a healthier place, was able to quickly remind myself that I'd worked through this before, and was already on a surer footing. And I knew to stay close to my wife and talk about where this anxiety might be coming from. And this all brought some understanding. Just being with another person helped. But the waves of panic just kept coming and coming. My breathing exercises weren't working. I kept standing and pacing. I walked around the house. I tried to clear my head, ironically, by isolating myself. And then changing tactics, I decided to help Edward get up. He was still in bed at the time, and get him going for the day. My thinking was, instead of detaching, maybe I could connect, and that would be a good distraction. But it ended up being so much more. The moment I entered into Edward's room, I opened my heart to him and told him I loved him. And he jumped out of bed and he hugged me. And throughout that morning, I'd been shivering in my panicked state, and so his very soft and warm, full-bodied hug was a gift. During my first panic attack, I'd read that one of the antidotes for anxiety is increasing your bodily awareness. Breathe deeply, move your muscles, touch something. Getting hugged by Edward certainly fit the bill. His embrace warmed my whole being, as though he was somehow transferring some of his peace to me. And after I helped him shower, I decided to give him a shave. He could have gone another day, but I had to do this for me. I needed to care for him with the kind of focus that only a razor could exact. Again, it was therapeutic and helped me take my mind off myself. Noticing a small bead of red beside his mouth, I realized I'd nicked him. Then I felt something entirely new, a deep sense of tenderness and compassion like I'd never felt before. And as I blotted the blood with a tissue, I leaned in to make sure he was okay and whispered a gentle apology, and then finished his shave. Because of my highly sensitive state, I'm still having panic attacks as all of this is happening. I reacted with a tenderness that surprised me. It was as though I was channeling the heart of God, fully attentive, naturally protective, and tenderly addressing Edward's smallest need. Later, as I packed Edward's lunch, I felt that tenderness, that tender awareness again, this time through the tactile goodness of preparing, reaching into the refrigerator for the ingredients, spreading peanut butter with a knife, and cutting and wrapping his snack. My hyper-aware state enabled me to see and sense reality more clearly. I'd done these same tasks many times before, but on this morning, it was as though I was doing them for the first time, and I could see them for what they really were. I was a person helping another person, and that I could do anything that morning felt like a miracle. My hands worked. My mind was ordered enough to prepare Edward for his day. I could feel the cold air as I opened the fridge and the warmth of the coffee cup I just handed to him. After breakfast, I sat beside Edward on the couch as we waited for his bus. and I held my face next to his, eye to eye, cheek to soft, smooth cheek. I let Edward hold me for as long as he wanted, wanting him to hold me longer. Don't we all want this from God? To be held and be safe and have our deepest fears met by an eternally soft love? To be near to God and hear God whisper words of comfort and well-being? Our hearts yearning to hear God's quieting words, I'm here, I'm with you. For most of my caregiving life, I believe that Edward humanizes me by being a person I can care for. But that morning, I realized that sometimes he humanizes me by saving me and simply being with me and caring for me. My high-touch, high-needs son was the ideal person for grounding my anxious reality. Because he needs so much attention, he took all of my attention in the best of ways. And when I attended, I, surprise of surprises, saw how much he was really there. And somehow, in seeing that Edward was there, I knew that God was there too. My panic subsided as mysteriously as it began. I tried to understand what had just happened. How could this horrible experience of panic lead to such insight and presence? I've never seen Edward and the activities of ordinary life with such clarity. Could it be that I'm made to be this vulnerably hyper-aware? And what if I intentionally lived into the weakness of hypersensitivity more? Would I be more fully awake to life? Could I step into this high alert way of being without having to be pushed by a panic attack? In that moment, it was as though weakness was reframed for me. And instead of being something to be avoided, I wondered if it was something I could embrace. When Edward came home from his program later that day, I stopped in the kitchen, crouched in front of him, and looked into his face and said, "Thank you for this morning. You really helped your dad. You're such a good son. Thank you." Now, it's rare that Edward maintains eye contact in conversation, and rarer still that he tears up at the emotional weight of a moment. He knew what had happened that morning. He remembered that it was important, and he knew that he was the helper. As I was panicking, Edward knew his giftedness. And I'm convinced that weakness in both Edward and I made room for all of this to happen. All of these good relational things. When we're weak, we can be in touch with some very tender parts of ourselves, parts that God made and parts that God wants to bring to life again. I thought about Edward's grounding presence for days after my panic attack. His weakness made him approachable, and my weakness enabled me to approach him, to draw near, and appreciate his strength. As far as I know, Edward doesn't get existentially anxious. He's level-headed, content, and he knows who he is. And as I leaned on him in my weakened state, I could see his strength and peace in a way like I'd never seen them before. In that moment, that morning, he was more grounded than I was. He was stronger than his dad. And it took a severe panic attack for me to realize I was still carrying a bias when it came to Edward. The limitations that are always there and they're real that come with Down syndrome blinded me to the strength of this very gentle, settled, and present nature that he embodies and brings and is a gift to bring to our world. This was the first time I noticed this in Edward, and it took a panic attack to finally see him for who he is. Well, did not expect the emotion of retelling that story. All right. I then went on for the rest of the chapter and talked about the weakness of God, right? Kenosis puts aside his strength to take on a human body. I mean, it's just all right there theologically that Edward, he's imaging God in his ability to be weak in that kind of a strong way. Last year, I interviewed a researcher named Joaquin Espinosa from Denver at a world-leading Down syndrome research institution called the Linda Chernick Institute for Down Syndrome. And he taught me about all kinds of things they're learning in their research about people with Down syndrome. One is that they have a biologically different fight, flight, or freeze sympathetic response from other, normals, people who don't have Down syndrome. When people with Down syndrome face fearful situations, it takes them longer for their adrenaline to kick in and their heart rate to increase. And Dr. Espinosa, in his research, believes that this phenomenon is very much or might be connected to that extra chromosome Edward has. And he believes that people with Down syndrome may actually sense and experience and respond to the world in a different and unique way than the rest of us, others. He also believes there's wisdom, scientific wisdom, to be gained in researching these differences. And so he's going on about all of this stuff, and I'm just thinking it's so amazing that somebody's doing science on paying attention, right, Ty? Paying attention to your kid in this way. But I went back to the panic attack, and I thought, was Edward's ability to be a calming presence in the face of my fear like natural, like a biological gift for that high-stress moment? Is he physically, and I think he is, physically predisposed to be a non-anxious presence? And will science, in doing their research now at that clinic, that huge research institution, be able to one day discover through researching people with Down syndrome some good treatment options for the rest of an anxious world that they'll be able to come to understand through the research of the cohort of people that are people with Down syndrome. Does Edward literally embody some world-changing wisdom in this regard? That's one thing. And then I go, well, what else does he embody? At the same time I interviewed Dr. Espinosa, I tripped on an article written by several Calvin University professors on the theology and philosophy of disability. And in that article, the theologian John M. Hall noted that a person with a disability, and it was just a phrase, but it really struck me, a person with a disability, quote, knows the variety of human conditions and thus has an opening into other worlds. And Ty sort of pointed in that direction in his talk. People with disabilities can show us and open up to us new worlds. A few weeks ago, on a New Leaf talk, a Zoom call like this, Ty asked me, what has writing my new book taught me about how churches could better include people with disabilities? And my response surprised me, Ty. It was sort of off the cuff, but instead of talking about removing barriers to typical church activities, make room for people with disabilities to be on the worship team, pass out the communion elements, be part of all of the activities that churches do, I wondered if there were new activities, brand new ways of worship that we've yet to even imagine, new worlds in terms of what church could be, that would naturally come from the worldview of a person with a disability. And at the time, I ended up by saying, I have no idea what that would look like, but wouldn't that be an amazing kind of thing for churches to then begin transitioning into, or broaden into, or become themselves fully into? But now, thinking about Edwards, this one thing that the story I just told you was pointing to, that he images the non-anxious presence of God. Maybe there is a ministry of companionship where he could lead. In part, I'm writing the book because I want people who've never lived in a home with a person with a disability to know how rich this is. And I can't rent Edward out to everybody in the world, so you write the stories down. But a ministry of companionship in the church where people hang with Edward, and they might help him by picking him up or helping him with language. He's mostly nonverbal. Help him in some practical ways, but Edward would be helping them by just modeling chill and grounded, and I see you, and I don't judge you, and this is what it looks like to be fully yourself. Maybe instead of preaching sermons on stress, and I'm guilty of that, the church could let Edward be the sermon, an embodied example of a carefree life. Where, I don't know, you have a small group where we all talk about that with Edward there, who's totally nonverbal. So we'd be doing most of the talking. But we'd also be learning how he communicates and replace what he does in lieu of words and just go to school on him. As a theologian, Edward is made in the image of God. So I believe any human being, were we to pay enough attention, can teach us something, and something unique in terms of their unique image bearing about the nature of God. Edward follows. It's incredible. He just follows. He follows naturally. He follows easily. If our Christian faith is ultimately expressed in our capacity to follow Christ's teachings, to follow God, to follow the Holy Spirit, then my son Edward arguably does that better than his theologian, pastor, dad does. Like, way better. He's a natural-born follower. Anyway, all these ideas, right? And that's just Edward. Other people with other disabilities. What would it mean for a church to sit down and see how they see the world, and then imagine in the course of that conversation, listen to what the Spirit would reveal in the course of that conversation about a whole new way of doing church for someone with autism who can't handle too much stimulation. 20 minutes in a dimly lit room where nobody makes a peep. Go to school on the Quakers on that. And anyway, Trey talked about, wouldn't it be beautiful on that one day when Leland is in heaven and he's like the rest of us again, and the horror of hearing that as a dad with a disability. I was reading or working on a chapter of this book last year, and my wife remembered a book she read by a guy named Randy Alcorn who talked about a boy with Down syndrome, and I went and searched it out, and in the story, he tells the story of a boy with Down syndrome who, when he got to heaven, became the greatest teacher ever, and everyone in heaven came to the places where he would teach, and this person with Down syndrome was a great philosopher, an academician. And I thought, oh, no way, I do not want that for Edward. I want Edward to be Edward in heaven. My vision would be different than that. And then shortly after that, I read Globe and Mail columnist Ian Brown, who has a son Walker with a severe disability, cardiofasciocutaneous syndrome. I read a portion of his book called Boy in the Moon, where at the end he dreams about what might be. And I'll wrap up with this, just a short quote. He says, "These days I have a fantasy of my own. In my fantasy, Walker and people like him live in a L'Arche-like community with the help of assistants. It's a beautiful place and a beautiful spot with a view of the sea or the mountains, because for once in this place, it isn't just those who can afford them who have access to the best views, but people who might need beauty even more because they live with so much less. In my fantasy, this village is owned and inhabited owned and inhabited by the disabled on their schedule, at their pace, according to their standards of what is successful. Not money or results, but friendship and fellow being, fellow feeling, and companionship. In my fantasy, it is the rest of us, his words, normals, who have to be integrated into their society, who have to adapt to their pace and their place. I can leave, I can go back to more pressing and ambitious and even my more interesting life, but I can also return to live with Walker as Walker lives, slowly and without much of an agenda beyond merely being himself. And that village is the kind of church that I would want to be a part of. Can you imagine a place where us normals, whoever, whatever that even is, but where everyone has the space to fully be who they are and all of their quirkiness. That scientist started my interview with him saying, we're all genetically diverse. Every one of it. There is no human being that is the same as another human being. Can you imagine that place where you can belong and contribute fully, exactly, in a way that is 100% commensurate with who you are? So that is my dream, and I think that's God's dream, because in my experience, the more I've learned to live with difference, the larger I've become, the more fully I've imaged an all-inclusive God. All right, that's me with 2 minutes to spare, Eric.
Thank you, John, for that. That was yeah, it was beautiful to listen to, and um, it's hard to live in a world where you are, like you're praised or you thrive when you're functioning or strong, right? Like that, just such heavily. There's so much value to that, and we see so much of the opposite too with what God can do when we are in a place where we can only depend on Him, and we see our weakness not as always as burdens, but as places where God can just do His good work. Like there there's such like learning and growth and connection with God in those places that you don't have in those other moments where kind of doing things in your own strength and your own yeah.
When I pitched this book to publishers before they got Herald picked it up,
Mhm.
my working title was On Being Remade. That this was a book about a dad, a type A driven, anal, performance oriented, all of those metrics of our culture, attuned human being transformed through the mysterious, painful gift of a kid with a disability.
Mm,
They reoriented it, but it's the story. I forget the book. The last 34 years have been all about that. God's brilliance in bringing Edward into my and his mom's life. His mom's pretty normal and not as neurotic as his father. So, but the healing that came, God
mhm,
bringing tender care through Edward's life, and
mhm. Yes, thank you.
yeah, thanks for the
Yeah.
comment.
Like I feel like I experienced it more myself, and not obviously the same, but just that, God moving in those moments that you don't expect. Just I ended up having very severe like postpartum anxiety and OCD, and just in those moments where my life fell apart, seeing the goodness of God in that, in the people that were around me when I, yeah, had to, let's say, depend or learn, but also just the places of vulnerability and bringing light to that, um, and how there's community in that too, and that you don't have to be fully functioning perfect, let's say, parent to to be thriving, right?
Mm,
You can meet each other in these hard places, and it's so much clearer to see God, I find, in
mm,
those.
mhm.
But I don't want him to have to I don't wanna always have to go there to see him clearly. Like, I don't wanna need the panic attack to feel the
Yeah,
sensitivity to the spirit, but I
yeah,
wanna take when I did have that to remind myself, right? Yeah.
yeah.
It's, yeah,
We're life to give us that, right? That we could always see what we get in retrospect in the moment.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
but still, you end up when Edward turned 15, okay, this is how long it took me. Um, I prayed a prayer that morning where wholeheartedly and genuinely, and not because I knew I ought to, I thanked God for the day of his birth, the
mm,
most painful day in our lives at the time, mine.
mhm,
It was had in my mind become the greatest day, bringing the greatest gift, and just wholehearted gratitude. And
mhm,
how does God, I think that is what the end of when we all see God face to face. That is exactly the kind of reframing math that will kind of play out, however, in the mystery of God that happens.
mhm.
But yeah, I hear you on the not needing any more of those beautiful experiences. It means the pain, right?
Yeah, and I guess a question that just popped in my mind, maybe Ty, you can speak to it also, is like when you look at, like that God, is this idea of like a new heaven and a new earth. And because I teach children all the time and they're like, well, what does it look like? Like, will I still be afraid of spiders, or will I, be a kid in this body? Or I guess, I don't know, maybe that's a big question, but yeah, like, no, I don't, in heaven, I don't need, like, no one needs to be something than who they are, but what also will it look like, I guess, in that space? I don't know, does that make sense? Like,
I always imagine it just as fully you.
Mhm.
So in the case of anxiety and panic attacks, like even more sensitive than you're learning to be, and even more vulnerable, right? I have two sisters who are highly emotional, vulnerable, caring, deeply caring women who I was nothing like growing up, ever. Totally different people. Who are these people? And now saw them last week and realized you're their brother and you've just built walls. And so m- me, fully me, in terms of that one innocent, almost naively sensitive person. So you, in all of your you-ness, right?
mm,
All
mhm,
that is you that Jesus imagined when all things were made
mm,
and you were conceived back in your fullness again.
mm. Thank you.
I got
That's
that. Yeah.
You got
Listening
nothing?
at that.
Come on,
I
Ty.
was
No.
basically talking about all those barriers that keep us from being who we are. So
Mm,
just as
Mm,
John had phrased it, are gone.
mm,
We overcomplicate it
mhm,
or want to remove things that make us uncomfortable. Yeah, it's the full you-ness. But with the caveat, as one mentor once told me, once we get there, I'll probably spend a lot of time laughing over what I've already believed here on earth.
mhm,
mm,
But yeah, I think
mhm,
it is. It is that. It's that idea of whatever was holding us back
mm.
from being our complete selves is gone.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, because sometimes, well, I guess this is probably like the our legacy of like colonialism, and so much of our faith is like this punitive faith, right? Where it's, everything is about sin, but also it's like we sometimes turn gifts into sin, like this, like
Mhm.
we're told to not be anxious. And it's like, well, yes, sure. But as in, it's such a hard thing. It turns into it's a sin to be anxious as opposed to a gift. There's also gifts of sensitivity in there and relying on God and being more perceptive to, let's say, what's going on in the world or the feelings that are inside your body or going on with other people. But we're very I think that's I feel like I'm struggling with, yeah, is we see so much as deficit unless we're this ideal creature,
Mhm.
as opposed to seeing it's kind of like it's all mingled a little bit, right? Like,
Hmm.
I don't know if that's correct, but
Yeah.
mm,
And
thanks for that perspective. Mhm.
it just reminds me of, and I haven't read a lot of these books yet, but I probably should, but all the evolutionary psychology books and people looking at neurodiversity through the lens of how these things were gifts
Mhm.
to previous, generations and earlier humanity, right? Um, we'll know the giftedness of all
Mhm.
of those things that are you, right?
Mhm.
And in knowing the giftedness of it, live out of, in terms of being a gift to others in that perfect heaven on earth community
Mhm.
more.
Well, thank you. I'm going to take a quick break and come
Yeah,
back.
me
But
too.
thank you.